And welcome to our 154th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. The Roses series is now sponsored generously by the Sports Economics Review, a relatively new journal in the field, edited by Stefan Szymanski, our speaker for today, and Alex Creamer, who is also in the audience and a regular participant. Before we start, I wanted to just share a little bit about conferences and in-person meetings that we have lined up for the coming summer. So obviously we're lucky enough to meet on a regular basis here in this forum, but it's quite nice when we get the chance to meet in person. And there is a European Spring Tour Sports Economics with 3 conferences in particular, one of which is sponsored by the Sports Economics Review. My apologies if that goes off the edge of the screen. I don't think I've quite aligned it properly. But on May the 7th to 8th, we've got the 3rd Reading Football Economics Conference, which will be joint with the 7th Sports Economics Sports Management Conference, run by the International Association of Sports Economists historically. Please do join us for that. The keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker confirmed, is Colin Camera from Caltech, so that promises to be a really interesting event. You can either follow the link that I will put in the chat, or if you're able to, there's a little QR code down here in the corner that you can use that should take you to the submission point for a paper for that conference. You can also submit there if you're interested in attending the 10th Football and Finance Conference at the University of Duisburg-Essen on May the 13th, 14th, which is up here. The Reading Conference is up here on my screen. And in between that, we've got the 18th Gijón Conference on Sports Economics. And you can, if you want to, fly direct between the two. Depends how much you like flying with Ryanair between Asturias and Düsseldorf Visa, which is a little way. And I've put on the slide convenient for Duisburg, but some of my German friends would dispute the idea that Düsseldorf Visa is convenient for anywhere at all. But there are flights you can get connecting between Asturias and Düsseldorf, should you want to. Those are 3 conferences. I was conscious myself that I end up missing deadlines, so there's a few deadlines here worth flagging up. One thing is that the North American Association of Sports Economists are organising their sports sessions at the Western Economic Association International Conference in Seattle. And if you're still keen on presenting there, please do act on that ASAP. I will put some information with a link in the chat for you. And you can, if you don't see that, you can email me and I can email you with the information you need. There's also the German Economic Association Conference in Beirut, which I understand the deadline for that is flexible. So you might still try there. And again, information I'll put in the chat. Our conference, I've already given you that, and there's a bigger QR code should you want to use that, sponsored by the Sports Economics Review. Gijón Conference is emailing Placido, the organizer, directly by April the 1st. And the other thing to say is that the deadline for our conference in Reading and also the Duisburg conference, Bernd Frick is organising with Joachim Prinz. The deadline for that is coming up fast, February the 29th. And so follow the QR code, submit a paper, we'll submit an abstract at this stage ASAP. Raphael Flepp, Carl Singleton and Romain Gario are organising a conference on a special issue. And the conference is in Zurich. March the 15th is the deadline for that, and the conference itself is June the 22nd, a 1-day workshop there. Again, I'll put the information in the chat. The ESEA, European Sports Economic Association Conference in Rotterdam, that deadline is March the 22nd, and that's the same time as there's a Seed 14 conference in Madrid, the Ibero-American Conference, Spanish Economic Association, also has a deadline of March the 22nd. I don't want to take any more of Stefan's time, so I'm going to unshare my screen. I'll put more information on these deadlines in the chat. They're always in the reminder. Stefan.
James.
Yeah.
I think that the deadline for the ASEA is March 15. I'm going to check.
I've got it wrong then. Thank you. Yeah.
But I thought it was 15. So And
That's
there's
probably my
usually
mistake. Yeah.
a peak of submissions on the deadline day. So that's I'll
Yeah.
check, but you should also check.
Yeah, I'll check definitely, but sometime in March, and make sure you get your submissions in for that. Organised in Rotterdam by Jan and Thomas Peters, amongst others. Stefan, without further ado, please do take away your talk on cricket, West Indian cricket.
Great, thank you. And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Go full screen mode. Okay. So thank you for coming, everybody. This is actually the second cricket paper I've presented at Roses. And this one is about the white captain era of West Indian cricket. So between 1928 and 1960, mixed race teams represented the West Indies in international cricket competition. But in 83 out of 84 games played in that era, the captain was white. Now, it's important to say from the beginning that in a game of cricket, the captain is a very significant actor in a way that is different from, I think, almost any other team sport. They're captain. If you think about soccer or football or basketball or any other sport, the captain really, there's a captain, but they're really not making fundamentally significant decisions either off the field or on the field. But that's not true in cricket. So the captain is typically closely involved in drawing up the strategy even before the game is played. And then during the game is responsible for almost all tactical decision making that takes place. And there are significant tactical decisions to be taken in a game of cricket. So the captain is not, this is not an honorific, this is a significant role, much more so than in other team sports. So here's a quote from Michael Manley, who wrote a history of West Indian cricket, a very large volume. You may have heard of Michael Manley. He was the Prime Minister of Jamaica in the 70s and 80s and a significant political figure in his own right. And what he says is in his history is, in selecting captains, the selectors acted to preserve opportunity for their own class. In doing this, they were quite confident that the best interests of the sport were being protected. To support this view, it was assumed that black sons of the working class were not equipped for leadership. Here's another quote from Leary Constantine. Leary Constantine is a really, really important figure in the history of cricket in general, and actually in West Indian politics, and actually also, as I would mention later, in British politics. So he was perhaps one of the greatest players in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He played for the West Indian team. He was a kind of regular player. He played, so he was a very famous player. He wrote several books. He's a very interesting man. And he said in a book he published in 1946, he says, I think the time has come to speak out plainly what I mean in this matter of West Indian captaincy. It is not only what I mean. Every coloured player who has ever turned out for an international side has been conscious of it, and it rots the heart out of our cricket, and always will until it is changed. The West Indies team, mainly composed as they always are of coloured players, should have a coloured captain. If you watch the selection of the West Indies team, it will be noticed that there is always a white captain. Even in cricket, you see, it's not the most confident captain that is chosen. The atmosphere of servitude is fostered, and we know it well. And here's a quote from a white captain. And this is a guy called Jackie Grant, who was actually captain for several years in the 1930s. And here's a comment that he made in his autobiography about being selected for the first time. I was younger than all of the 16 players save 3, and most of these 16 had already played for the West Indies, and I had not. Yet I was the captain. It could not be disputed that my white colour was a major factor in my being given the post. So clearly, I think it's beyond doubt there was a white captain policy in West Indian cricket from the 1920s onwards. So the issue is, can we identify any measurable consequences in terms of team performance? And that's really what I'm going to focus on. Now, measuring impacts on team performance is not the only consequence of this, and I'm not trying to pretend that it is. And in fact, what I want to start off by saying is, in order to interpret the performance statistics, you actually need to spend a bit of time thinking about the context. Oh, there's a hand up. Okay.
Yes, Stefan, just a short question. Who selects the captain?
Oh, I'm going to come to that. So that would the short answer is there is a board of selectors for each test match. So, but I'll explain that in more detail a bit later, and who that is. But that's an important question, and I will come back to that. So I don't know if you know this quote. Many people probably do know this quote. What do they know of cricket who only cricket knows? This is probably one of the most famous quotes in all of cricket, and probably written in a book, The Beyond a Boundary by CLR James, which I would argue is the greatest book on sports ever written. It's better than anything else that you can name. And we should have sometime, if we're all in a bar together, I'm happily to conduct that debate about what is the best book on cricket. And the importance of this book, and this is, I mean, what's interesting about this book that it is taught in sociology courses across the world often by people who actually don't know anything about the game of cricket, because this book was an important commentary on the social development of the Caribbean nations, the West Indies, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And what CLR James did was use cricket to put in context the political developments that were going on at the time. So in order to understand, I think also the data that I'm going to share with you, and I am going to get to data, don't despair, but in order to get there, I need to explain more about the social context, particularly for those of you who are not familiar with this game or with what even we're talking about with the West Indies. So I need to talk about the social context of cricket, colonialism, because we are talking about islands that were colonies of the British at this period. We need to talk about how we're even going to talk about identifying white. What is white? What do we mean? What is non-white? What are we talking about? And then think about how to measure the bias. I want to get then to the consequences for the team performance. And then I'm going to finish up by telling you a little bit about what happens afterwards, about what happens after this era. So let me start. Cricket. So international cricket is at the highest level is played in what is called test matches, and there are test match nations. So you need to acquire test match status. The first test match was between England and Australia in 1877, and since then there have only been 12 nations that have acquired test match status. Two, most recently, Afghanistan and Ireland, only in 2017. And all of these test match nations, it will be noticed, are former colonies of the British, except for Afghanistan. And if you read your history, you'll know it was not for want of trying. Some of Britain's biggest military defeats were actually attempting to conquer Afghanistan. So it's very much something that is associated with British colonial rule, for reasons which are in themselves interesting. There are more nations that play cricket. There is a world governing body of cricket, which actually goes back to 1909. There are currently 108 members, and it's actually going to be included in the 2028 Olympic Games as a sport. So there are, beyond the test match nations, there are other places where cricket is played, but essentially to gain test match nation status, you need to be good enough to compete with the existing test match nations. And there are a few other countries that could really aspire to that. Just the technicalities of the game, they're not going to concern us too much, but of course it always causes great laughter amongst non-cricket fans. This is a game that can go on for 5 days. They play in 3 2-hour sessions a day, and then at the end of those 5 days, the match can be drawn, and it is quite often drawn. So, but still, it's a serious game that people are playing at very high levels. then they'd say, well, what the West Indies? So, I mean, we used to bandying this term around. What exactly are we talking about in terms of the West Indies? Well, here's a map of the British Caribbean colonies in 1914, which gives you a sense of what we're talking about. So the West Indies really consists of 4 principal locations where cricket is played intensively. The island of Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, which is on the mainland of South America, and Jamaica. And so you can see here actually on the map that Barbados, Trinidad, and Guyana are all very close together, and Jamaica is sort of a bit of a way off. Now, these are not the only islands or the only locations where cricket is played. You can see I've listed all the other island associations that belong to the governing bodies known as the West Indies. So what happened here was in the colonial era, where cricket became popular in this area, the British decided that they would entertain the concept of a team drawn from all of these different locations. But actually they're quite different. And there's some rivalries, there's some significant rivalries which we'll discuss particularly between Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana, and Jamaica. You need to say a little bit about the colonial background to this. Now, these locations, Barbados and Jamaica were actually seized, captured by the British quite early on, 1627 and 1655. Guyana and Trinidad were basically taken in the wars that followed the aftermath of the French Revolution. The main economic basis of these islands was the production of sugar. And the sugar production in these islands in the 17th and 18th century made the absentee landlords immensely rich. They became they were the plutocrats of the era. They were the Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. So I'm suggesting in the background there. They were the super rich of their era. And this immense wealth was bought at the cost of immense suffering. So during this period, the British brought about 3 million Africans to the islands as slaves. I think everybody's familiar with the idea that in the crossing, many people died. But not only that, once you got to the islands, life on these as a slave was unbearably painful. Your average life expectancy on arrival, if you arrived alive, your life expectancy was still only 7 to 9 years. So what you have is immense wealth being extracted with immense brutality. Now, Britain did finally abolish the slave trade in 1806, but didn't abolish slavery on the islands until 1834. And when they did so, they paid compensation to the slave owners. And that amounted to, in today's money, is estimated to be about 17 billion pounds that was paid. Quite shockingly, actually, the last payment was only made in around 2010, which is a kind of shocking thing to know. But that's the background that you need to know about that. Now, let's say something about cricket. So cricket is a game that has been known. We have evidence of cricket being played from about the end of the 16th century, probably before that, but that's when we have sort of written records that tell us about this. And an important thing about the way cricket was played was that from its very earliest days, it involved mixing across classes. There was always mixing in cricket. So the aristocrats tended to be the sponsors of the game. And as I think everybody understands, cricket is a bat and ball game. So the aristocrats liked batting, but they didn't like bowling, which is in American, in baseball you call pitching. They didn't like that activity because it required effort. And so they actually, they got their laborers to do the bowling for them. So you always had, from the very get-go in cricket, you had this social mixing that was going on, no real social segregation, as you might have expected, in what was, of course, Britain was always seen itself as a very class-conscious society where people tend not to mix so much. But actually, this was on the cricket field, there was quite a lot of mixing going on. So the game flourished in the 18th century, but actually fell into decline at the beginning of the 19th century, and was really only revived in the 1830s when it really started to become a well-organized game. And the first championship, the county championship, emerged in the 1860s as a competition between, if you like the club competition that we see in soccer, based on county regions, and that was established by the 1860s, first ranked championship rankings in 1864, and then the first test match, the first international game played against Australia in 1877. And on the right here, that rather fine gentleman is a guy called W.G. Grace, who you might not, to look at him, you might not believe it, but he's actually probably is widely credited with being the guy who really popularized the game and made it in England, in some sense, a truly national sport. He was a man of great personality and great skill, and he was credited with really popularizing the game. So now let's talk about cricket in the Caribbean. So again, earliest records of cricket being played in the Caribbean go back to about 1800. There were mentions of games, but really the first intercolonial match is between British Guyana, what's now Guyana, and Barbados in 1846. And there are kind of sporadic games being played like this for the rest of the century. And then the intercolonial tournament between, again, mainly between the four main centers, Guyana, Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica, that starts in 1891. And then touring teams from England start to come out to play. So the first touring team from England comes in 1895. The first West Indian team to come to England is in 1900. And in 1923, there's a tour of England, which is where the team is so successful. They win so many games that the English say, oh, you know what? You could play test match cricket. You could play that. And actually, the English authorities then encouraged the creation of a governing body in the West Indies that will play test matches, will achieve test match status, which they do finally in 1928. So just to establish the population now, one of the things is, this is from the West Indian census of 1946, to give you an idea of the population distribution. Again, race classifications are always controversial because it's obviously it's not a scientific category. It's a social construct rather than anything objective. Although back in these days, people still tended to think that there was a scientific basis to race classification. But what you can see is, so here you can see the classification across the colonies in the Caribbean. And the thing to notice there is that the white population, which is synonymous with the European population, is very, very small. So it's just about 2% of the total population. Then about 64% of the population is defined as African, which is also usually in most of the discourse is synonymous with the term black. Then mixed is 18% of the population, and mixed, the term of art used in the Caribbean throughout most of history and still today is colored. The colored means mixed, and mixed, that's right. And then the third large category here is Asiatic. So, and that's 15%. And Asiatic means there were large numbers of workers from India, from the Indian subcontinent, who were brought as indentured laborers to the colonies. And also there were a large number of Chinese migrants. So, so that's those other countries. And so the important thing to bear in mind is how tiny the white population is. And when we say European, we don't just mean British origin. So particularly there were quite a large number of, and still are quite a lot amongst the white community, there's a large fraction that are of Portuguese origin, which is something you'll notice later, but also Spanish, German, Italian, and Jewish minorities as well. So here's a quote about the way that the social organization and the economic organization of these islands from the Nobel Prize winner, the economics Nobel Prize winner Arthur Lewis, who was from the West Indies. So he said, economically and politically, the white man is supreme. He owns the biggest plantations, stores, and banks, controlling directly or indirectly the entire economic life of the community. It is he whom the governor most often nominates to his council, and for his sons that the best government jobs are reserved. Socially, the whites in general constitute the aristocracy. They run their own clubs from which non-whites are excluded, and it is they who constitute the court life of His Majesty's representative, the governor. And now here's another quote from CLR James, who talks about what the implications of this. And again, bear in mind that in terms of the statistics I just showed you, here's what he writes. The Negroid population of the West Indies is composed of a large percentage of actually black people and about 15 or 20% of people who are of varying combination of white and black. From the days of slavery, these have always claimed superiority to the ordinary black. With emancipation in 1834, the blacks themselves established a middle class, but between the brown-skinned middle class and the black, there is a continual rivalry, distrust, and ill feeling, which, skillfully played upon by the European peoples, poisons the life of the community. I think you're starting to get a sense of some of the general currents within which this game is being played. And this plays out in cricket in significant ways. And what you can see here is, here's another quote from CLR James, where he talks about the different clubs, cricket clubs. So you would play in a club, but here the clubs were socially segregated in quite serious ways. So there's Queen's Park Club, boss of the island's cricket relations with the other islands, for the most part white and often wealthy. So notice he says not exclusively white. So some probably colored people are allowed in, but dominated by the whites and the rich whites. And then Shamrock, club of the old Catholic families, almost exclusively white. But what he also says about them is that they're poor. They're not rich white people, they're poor white people. Maple, club of the brown-skinned middle class. Shannon, club of the black lower middle class. And then Stingo, totally black and no social status whatsoever. You can see that social status plays a significant role in which club you play for, and you can think that's going to affect significantly opportunities for competition in sports. So this comes back to Jorge's question, which is when we think about these teams, then who's in charge and who's running everything, right? So at the time, it was founded as it was called the West Indian Board of Control. It's now called Cricket West Indies. So it's established in 1926, having been promised that by the English that they will get test status if they do this, if they organize this. So what happens is the wealthy white folk of the islands get together to plan this out, to organize games, so to structure and organize the intercolonial games, but also to structure the test match games and the scheduling. And critically, financing. It's going to cost money to put these things on, and then only the rich white people have the money to actually organize it. Now, within this, factionalism is absolutely right. So the representatives of particularly Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana, Jamaica, each one is represented. Each is arguing for the inclusion of their own players in the team. If you read the histories of it, it's going on all the time. It's a constant fight between Trinidad and Barbados, or daggers drawn and so on. And the other interesting thing to note is the board, once it's established, chooses its own successors. So there's no possible outside influence on this. The existing board members decide who's going to be put new members on the board. And again, not surprisingly, it ends up that these are almost always white representatives who get onto the board. Not always, and they have some non-whites who are allowed on, but it remains dominated by the whites. So now we get to the test team selection. So how's the team being selected? So so in the period we're looking at between 1928 and March 1960, they played 84 test matches in 20 test series. So they play a series. They play 10 series against England. So that's the main team they're playing. 3 against Australia, 3 against India, 2 against New Zealand and Pakistan each. And then 12 of those were played away, and only 8 of those were at home. And here's the thing again, Jorge's question: captaincy and vice captaincy are selected by a committee of the governing body, and usually months in advance, so a long time before the game's going to be played. And then the rest of the team will be selected shortly before the games are played. So there's again this status and significance of the captain is vital. So, and selection was based on performance in inter-island games. So basically, you're picking the players who are playing well, right? That's going to be what you're doing. But then you have to face all these other factors that are going into what your race is, what your social status is, and which island you're from. So the data I have consists of, so if we've got 84 tests, there's 11 players on a team, so I've got 924 caps awarded, which are covered by 113 different players who were selected. And of course, not surprisingly, as in most sports, you have an elite at the top who are really the very best, and then you have a long tail of occasional players who don't make it. So 16 players in my data can account for 50% of all selections, 5 of whom are white and 11 who are non-white. So now to think about the functions. Essentially, the main functions, there's fielding, but the main functions are batting and bowling. So in the game, in a test match, each side will have 2 innings, 2 at-bats, if you will. So, and generally, the batting order is very significant. The best batters bat first, and the bowlers bat last. So the bowlers and batters, just like in baseball, pitchers and batters usually are they're separate skills, and if you're good at one, you're not usually good at the other. That same is true in cricket, although not a little bit less so. So it is possible to have people who can excel at both. And Leary Constantine, for example, we mentioned, was one such. But generally, you could think about the top 7 batters are generally specialist batters, and then 8 through 11 in the batting order are your bowlers. And they will do most of the bowling.
Stefan, there's a question from Daniele.
Yeah, very quickly, are you going to say something about when this, what happens in 1960? Why does this era of white captains end? And maybe that should be deferred for later, but why this sort of sharp end period, 1960? What happens then?
Well, for the first, a black captain is selected in 1960, and there is never a white captain ever after that. So that brings the white captain era to a firm close. Then you might say, well, okay, well, why does it end? And it's complex, right? So, and I was gonna mention this again, but I might as well say it. It's fine said now. So Jamaica and Trinidad become independent nations in 1962. And Barbados and Guyana become independent nations in 1966. So it's the end of colonialism. And when colonialism ends, black majority rule is clearly established. And so the status of the whites in the region then just vanishes. And that's not, even though they haven't achieved independence by 1960, it's coming, everybody knows it's coming. So there's a changing social attitudes, and so people are beginning to recognize that this is not a good thing, and so we're going to change it. But we can talk about that at the end as well. So now the data that I'm going to talk to you about is based on these things, scorecards. So basically, there's a website, Cricket Archive, that has records of thousands and thousands of games played back to 1877. And
Stefan,
so here's an
Stefan,
example. This is, sorry, yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt you again. Sarah's put a question in the chat, which is, what about the wicketkeeper? As presumably in that time period, wicketkeepers were not necessarily picked for their batting.
Well, that's an interesting question, actually. Actually, my sense is that the wicket keepers in this case were really in the batting class, and I haven't separated them out. I could do, but my sense is so far that the wicket keeper actually doesn't make very much of a difference to what I'm going to show. But it's an interesting point. So you've got this. So again, for the non-cricketers, you've got this other function, which is essentially the catcher. Who is, and so in baseball, the catcher is thought of as a batter and can be a star batter. That can also be true in cricket, but also it's a specialist skill where you might have somebody who'd accept who would not be particularly good at batting, but because they're very good as a wicket keeper. It's certainly something one could look at, but from my current view of the data, it's not actually having much of an influence. As I say, this is an example of the scorecard, and what it shows you is this is the very first Test match, and what this shows is that England batted first and scored a total of 401 runs. So unlike baseball, it's a sport in which runs are cheap and easy to come by. And then the West Indies batted. You see Leary Constantine there, the batting. They scored 177 runs, which is way short of the 401. They actually then batted straight on afterwards and scored 166. And so the total number of runs they scored was less than the total number of runs that England scored in their innings. And so England win the game by an innings and 58 runs. In other words, they scored 58 runs more than the West Indies after the West Indies had 2 innings, and even if West Indies had scored more than the England first innings score, England could have batted again and scored those runs. So this was a very decisive defeat, which is again not unusual in sports where you play your first competitive game against teams that have been playing for a long time. They were roundly beaten. And so what I did was I got somebody else to scrape all of the data for all of these games, and that's gives me the score, the runs scored, and what you can see here is the bowling statistics, which tells you how many wickets were captured. So again, the currency of cricket is runs and wickets, runs and outs in baseball, and you need to be able to score runs, and you stop the other team by scoring runs by taking their wickets. By getting rid of them, and so those are the key statistics that we're going to look at. So, in thinking about performance measurement, there are many indicators that you can use in batting and bowling, and the most popular really are for batting is batting average and strike rate, and in bowling average and strike rate. So runs per innings, runs per balls, runs conceded per wicket, and runs and wickets per 100 balls. It's actually not very convenient when we're looking at these groups to look at this because of the skew. So you have a big skew in the data because there are small number of players who play many times and a large number of players who play very rarely. And so the average, when you look at the averages for those who don't play very often, if you take averages, they will tend to dominate, and then that will kind of give you often give you a mistaken impression. So what I'm going to show you, and this is still a paper in development, so I'm open to suggestions about how to do this. I'm going to just focus initially really on just run scoring and wicket taking, which are the 2 key contributors to winning games. And since I'm really interested in the performance of groups, I'm interested in the performance of white players and non-white players, and thinking about how they contributed. I think that makes some sense. So race identification, how am I going to identify the place, the race of the place? Well, this is a non-trivial exercise. And I've had a lot of help from people, in particular, this guy, Joseph Pereira, who's a Guyanese journalist. He's in his 80s. And he actually knew a lot of the people that I'm talking about in my list. And he helped me identify who were white and black in his judgment. He also enlisted for me a guy called Cammy Smith, who played test matches for the West Indies a long time ago, who also knew many of these players. He's from Barbados. I had help from David Woodhouse, who wrote a fantastic book about a very famous tour by England to the West Indies in 1953-54. And Tim Wigmore, a cricket correspondent, who's also my co-author in Crickonomics. And then the other thing I was able to do for actually find images and do photographic search, and particularly for the test players, I was able to identify images of pretty much every single player who played in the test match, all 111 players. Both a lot of them from this book, The Complete Record of West Indian Cricketers, which has photographs, and then from web search. There's a lot of these kind of data now. So here you have the white players. So in the test matches, there were 29 white players who appeared. So these are the images. Now, some of them are a little grainy, so you might be not entirely convinced, but mostly they're pretty clear, I think. And I've starred the captains. Those are all of the captains. So there were some white players who were not captains, but you can see here the range. And I remember I mentioned before that there were, large part of the white community was Portuguese, of Portuguese descent, and you can see that in this. So you can see here, De Queiroz, Fernandes, Gomez, Nunez. These are all people of Portuguese descent, actually. So, but they were considered to be part of the white community, part of the European community. In this area. You've also got Stolmeyer here, J.B. Stolmeyer, who was actually a very good player, who was of German descent. Okay. So those are the white players and the white captains. You can see I'm just missing one picture there. And then now these are the non-whites, and here you have all of the images. Again, there's only one player who I couldn't really identify from either a picture or a relative. Again, pretty sure he was black. And you can see the one black captain there in this whole period is this guy, George Headley, who was a truly outstanding batter of his age, was one of the great players of his age. In the West Indies, they described Donald Bradman, who is most cricket fans know him as the greatest batter ever. Well, in the West Indies they described Bradman as the white Headley. They thought so. That Headley was actually better. So you can see, and again, you can see here that there are people who would be described, who would have presumably been many of them would be categorized as black, many of them who would be categorized as colored, and then several of them who were of Asian origin as well. So in the writing about this, there are many stories, and I've just given a few here of stories about how prejudice came into the selection. I mean, perhaps the one that people know is most famous is this guy, Gantome, who played one test match. He was selected for one game, and he scored 112 runs in one innings. And that is a very, very high score in cricket. That's when you get over 100 runs, it's called a century. And to get a century in Test cricket is really rare and special. So he played this one game, scored a century, and was never picked again. And he was definitely very bitter about this for the rest of his life. And large numbers of people wrote that this was a manifest injustice, that this guy should have been selected. Other cases, there's this guy, Tang Chun, a Chinese guy, who is, again, in the statistics, had incredibly good statistics in first-class cricket and was never selected. And then other examples, so Stolmeyer, one of the white captains, when they appointed a different captain, this guy JDC Goddard, who was uniformly deemed to be terrible at captaining, made terrible decisions all the time. Everybody thought this guy was a moron. Stolmeyer just said, I'm not playing anymore. I give up. If you're going to make him captain, I won't even do it. So that was something. And then sort of other sorts of incidents like Gilchrist. Gilchrist was a black bowler who was a very temperamental guy. He had issues, and he was on tour in Pakistan, and he did some things that maybe he shouldn't have done. And then the white captain just sent him home. And again, many of the black commentators said, well, you know, if you'd been white, you wouldn't have done that. You would have tried to understand, and you would have adopted a more tolerant attitude. And then in this famous tour of England, one of the most famous tours, 1953-54 England toured West Indies, there were many reports of local whites approaching the England players at cocktail parties and saying, you need to win to show who's in charge here. The West Indian whites saying they wanted the English to win because that would establish the dominance of the white race. So many perceived injustices. So let's look at some of the dates. Finally, some data. Okay, so these are the player appearances, and what you can see here is that the whites are in the orange and the non-whites are in blue, and you can see 24% of the appearances are by white players, and you can see a sort of trend there, a downward trend over time, although not terribly strong. But these are the years. Notice that there's a gap, obviously, the big gap between 1939 and 1948, which is obviously attributable to the Second World War, where obviously England's not playing Test match cricket and nobody's really playing Test match cricket. Nobody's playing Test match cricket in this period. Again, from 1928 to 1939, you can see that they're not playing every year, because again, it's days where to play these Test matches you have to travel by boat to get there. And in fact, it's only really 1953-54. That's the first time that England fly to the West Indies to play a Test match. So this is the year we're transitioning from the era of traveling by ship to traveling by airplane. So again, because these rate statistics can be quite slippery, I've just shown how many wickets were taken by white players. So remember, 24% of the appearances are by white players, but only 15% of the wickets. And it was well understood and well to be expected that many of the black players were specialist bowlers, so that they were particularly represented amongst the bowlers, and the star bowlers were almost always black players. So that was true. But it's also true that the white players scored a smaller fraction of all of the runs. So they scored 21%, I think 24% of the players and 21% of the runs. And what you can see here is, again, particularly by the late 1950s, the contribution of white players to scoring runs is really tailing off. So by the end of the 1950s, there's almost no contribution at all. But you can see there around 1951, the contribution of the white players to runs scored is almost as large as the contribution of the black players. So there are some periods where the white players are contributing a significant number of runs. So in order to try to disentangle this, I'm going to run some regressions. So I'm going to run regressions on my appearances of the players, run regressions of the runs scored and the wickets taken on observable characteristics of the players. I'm going the wrong way. Oh, sorry, just before that, this is distinguishing the captains and the non-whites. Were the captains contributing more or less than the rest of the white players? Well, it's a roughly, it's pretty much a wash. Again, you can see there in the period of 1948 to 1951, white non-captains are supplying a large fraction of the white runs, but in the rest of the time, it's more or less even between the captains and non-captains. Bear in mind that about half of the white players are the captains of the team. So here's a regression of test batting performance on a number of observable characteristics. So I've got the first column, the first row is just whether you're white or not. And then you've got age squared, and then your island. Which island were you from? And the thing to notice here is that the white characteristics, when we include all of the data, there's a negative coefficient, but it's not significant. So these are the number of runs. So this is how many runs more or less you contributed in each game that you played compared to the non-whites. But of course, remember the white players are principally selected on batting. That's what, and the black players dominate the bowling. So if we just focus on batters, so if we define a batter as someone who appears in the top 7 in the batting order, in the last column you can see that it's large. It's a large and statistically significant coefficient. Nearly 20 runs fewer than a black batter, essentially. So that suggests that the cost in any case, what's the cost of the white captain policy? The cost comes in the batting performance that you observe. And there are really two ways. Including the captains are not going to necessarily be as good as batters, but also because they're involved in selection and because they're likely to be prejudiced in selecting white batters than white players, then you're getting this bias in selection. But notice it's not the only one. If you look at the island, so the reference group for this is Barbados. And Barbados was really where the best cricketers came from in this era. It was a sort of the dominant island. And you can see here, particularly compared to British Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Barbadians are supplying a lot more runs than anybody else. So it's not just about the race, it's also about the regional rivalries that are involved here. Now let's look at the bowling performance. Again, if we look at the bowlers, again, actually, even when you look at all the data, the white players are significantly underperforming in terms of bowling, because bear in mind some of the batters are also good bowlers, but the batters who are good bowlers are almost all non-white. The whites were not good. Non-white batters were not generally very good at bowling. But when you focus on the bowlers only, the 8, 9, 10, 11 in the batting order, those are bowlers typically. You can see the number of wickets supplied per game is dramatically lower. 2.5 wickets, 2 to 3 wickets a game. That's a lot. There are only 22 wickets in an entire game, right? 2 innings, 20 in an entire game. So if you think of 2 to 3 out of that 20, that's a big difference. Again, you've got the regional struggles as well. So again, Guyana really is. So what you got to think is Guyana, the representative of Guyana on the cricket board is very influential and very successful at getting Guyanese players into the team, even though they're not very good and they're not performing. That's really what's going on. Whereas that's for bowling, it's not obvious for Jamaica or Trinidad. So the next question was this predictable? Could you have known this in advance? Could you have known that these white players were going to underperform in the test matches? Well, that's where we have these local games, what are called first class games. So first class means a high standard of cricket, but not international, not test matches. So this would be games between, say, Barbados and Trinidad, Jamaica and British Guyana, these kind of games, which are played on a regular basis. And between 1925 and 1960, I have 182 first-class games. I have, and again, the scorecards for these games. So my strategy here is to calculate the cumulative statistics in all games in a 3-year window before each test match. I was saying before a test match, how many runs had you scored in the previous years? How many wickets had you taken in the previous few years? And then I'm going to estimate your playing performance as a function of your cumulative statistics to see if it was predictable that you would be performing at a low level in the test matches, or whether these statistics would have predicted it. And of course, so that's just looking at the test match players. But then I'm going to go on to that, since I've got all the statistics on all the players who played first-class games who didn't play in test matches, so who were only first-class players, then I can do this. I can then estimate a selection probability as well. If I take the cumulative statistics of all the players, what was your selection probability based on your first-class statistics? So here first is the predicted performance of the test players. And so the obvious thing to notice, again, it was predictable that if you were white, that you were going to underperform, whether it's batting runs or test wickets. Because what you can see is now the next two variables are important. If you had scored more first-class runs, you were more likely to score test match runs. So that was your first-class run performance was a very good predictor of your test run performance. And likewise, if you'd taken first-class wickets, that was a good predictor that you would take test wickets. So cricket, like most sports, is a reasonably predictable game in the sense that good players are good players, kind of, and they stay good players. You don't suddenly switch from being a good player to being a bad player. It's kind of predictable who's good and who's not good. And you can also see, of course, the other thing to say is that if you don't players who are good at batting tend not to be good at bowling. So if you haven't taken first-class wickets, it's more likely that you're a batter. And likewise, if you're not very good at getting runs, it's more likely that you're a bowler as well. So that makes sense. And again, you can see the British Guyana tax as well. So again, British Guyana is underperforming in batting and wicket taking at test matches in a systematic way. Okay, so in that sense, I would argue it's predictable. So I think we all know what we expect to come next, right? So what we expect now is to say, well, now if we look at the selection probability, we expect to get a coefficient which says that you're more likely to be selected if you're white, given your performance, right? So if we can see the bias here, and we should expect that when we look at this performance we look at all first-class performances, which is going to amount to several hundred players, the selection probability is going to be higher if you're white, conditional on your batting and bowling performance, given what we've seen here, which is what I expected, but is not what I find. And this, I think, is really interesting. Actually, generally, you were less likely to be selected for a test match if you were white, conditional on your batting performance and your bowling performance, which, like I say, surprised me. And so it's in some ways, it's predictable that if you're white, you're going to underperform in a test match, but it's not predictable that you're more likely to get selected if you're white. So how can we explain it? So firstly, note that the number of observations has gone up here. We have a lot of observations. So we have 444 players, but we have 84 games. So we have the statistics for before each game for all of these players. So typically, before any test match, we have about 100 observations of what you might call available players who could play, but could have been selected and were presumably selected on the basis, in part at least, of their performance. Thanks to Pereira and his helpers, I've got race coding for about 90% of the players, of all of these 44 players. So I know the race of pretty much everybody who's playing. And so it seems really surprising that there isn't this bias. Now you can see that, you know, I've broken it first in all years, and you can see it's negative, but it's only at the 10% level. So we could probably say it's insignificant, but it is, the fact that it's negative is striking. And then you can see it's positive but not significant in the 1928 to 1939 era. But then it's clearly negative and very significant in the 46 to 54, which you remember. If you remember the date, looking at the aggregate statistics, that was an era where white players were actually not bad. If you were saying when were the white players in the test matches performing better than or performing more or less in line with the black players, that would be the period. Because then from 1955 to 1960, the black players the non-white players come to dominate. But even so, you still get a negative coefficient on white. It's not significant, so we maybe shouldn't attach any significance to it. But what we're definitely not getting is systematic evidence of a higher selection probability if you're white. So maybe to stop from this point, a good way to stop is just, well, let's just look at the averages in the first star statistic. Let's look at what was the performance. And what you can see here is, so the first thing to note is, just like, if anything, the proportion of white players in the first class game is actually larger than in the test matches, which is possibly a lot of what's driving this result, right? So it's about nearly 1/3 of the players, or 1/3 of the appearances are from white players in first class games. So in the local cricket that's being played in the West Indies, there is a very large fraction of white players. And if you look at the top panel and the all runs per game, what you can see is that the white players are contributing significantly more runs, but that's partly because the non-white players are contributing significantly more wickets. So again, you've got this specialization. The white players are more likely to be batters, and the non-white players are more likely to be bowlers. And again, you see this dominance in captaincy. Although they're only about a quarter of the data, they are the overwhelming source of the captaincy is on the white players. But there are some black captains. There are non-white captains. There are some non-white captains in the data. Few, but the majority are still white, but there's some non-white. And then, but if you look at specialist batters, it's a little bit more even. But even here, you can see the white batters are supplying slightly more runs per game, and the non-white batters are supplying slightly more wickets. So again, if you're a non-white batter, it's more likely that you'll actually be occasionally good at bowling than if you're white. And again, overwhelmingly, the captains are coming from the whites. So I think that's partly about understanding this result, is that what's going on is that you've got a very large fraction of these white players who are playing. And partly, bear in mind, this is sort of traditional. So if you think about colonial society in this era, you've got a small white population that is almost all playing cricket. If you're a white West Indian in this era and you're male, you almost certainly play cricket at some level. And many of them are good enough to do quite well in first class cricket. But when you step up to the test match level, turns out you're not so good. So you can also start to think of other explanations of this. One explanation of this might just be the nature of colonial society. If you're playing for Barbados against Trinidad, and say you're a non-white bowler and you're really good, but the captain of your team is white, and also happens to be a good friend of the Trinidadian white batter who's come up to bat. As captain, you have several chances. If you want your friend, who is on the other team, but he's still your friend, if you want him not to be humiliated by this very good bowler, you might take the bowler off. You might speak to the bowler and say, don't go so hard on him. You know, there's all sorts of strategies that might go on. So it might well be that when playing intercolonial games, the power structure plays a bigger role in determining outcomes than when you start to play test matches. So when you play test matches, presumably everybody on the team wants the team to win. And so there's no holding back. And so the non-white players play to their true capacity and expose the inferior level of the white players. That's sort of the sort of view that I've sort of come to on how to explain this. And what I'm also doing is thinking about the selection probability. What I've done here is create a chart of your selection probability as a function of your cumulative first-class runs scored in the previous 3 years. So I've ignored your bowling performance and just said, well, what's the probability of selection conditional on your batting performance, if you're white and if you're non-white. And what you can see here is that when you get over the horizontal axis is the number of runs you've scored in the previous 3 years. So what you can see is that over 1,000 runs actually looks like you're far more likely to get selected if you're non-white than if you're white. But the fact of the matter is there are very few white players in this category. Only 12% are white. Almost all of the star batters are non-white. But what you can see there is at the low end, when the cumulative runs are quite small, actually there's a point where you become more likely to be selected if you're white than if you're non-white. So what I did then was to look at the probability selection. I truncated the sample at having scored fewer than 400 first-class runs. So what happens to your selection probability if you're in the class of people who are not particularly good at batting? What's your selection probability? So one thing you notice, again, you see the vertical axis, that's the probability selected. You're not very likely to be selected at all, right? It's not very likely because you're not very good. However, you're more likely to be selected if you're white than if you're non-white in this case. And notice that this is a very large number of players, right? Because there are a few stars who score lots of runs and a tail of not very good players who never score many runs. And so you can see that there's going to be mostly the selection is going to be of the star players, but then you've got this occasional selection from the tail. And so this occasional selection would be enough to account for those very small number of not very good white batters. And one thing you can see here is that, and what's really driving this result is the impact of innings played on the number on your probability of selection. Essentially, if you're non-white, if you're white, then experience makes it more likely that you're going to select it. So if you played a lot of games, you're not very good, but you played a lot of games, then you are more likely to be selected. Whereas it's really the coefficient on, if you're non-white, is really much, much smaller. So as you play more games, it doesn't really make much difference to your probability selection. So your experience doesn't really count. And there, anecdotally, one can think of examples of this. So there's a very example. One of those players, I think C.V. White by name, white by race coding as well. And he was selected in as vice captain in one of the early test matches. And he had basically no experience whatever. And he was just a good egg. But people said, well, you know, he was good friends with the other white players, and he was thought of being a good guy, and therefore that explains how he was selected. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap up now and just say what happened next. So, so again, come back to Daniela's question. So in the late 1950s, there is actually quite a lot of pressure publicly to change this policy. And particularly, actually, CLR James led a very successful newspaper campaign to change the policy. And so finally, when they went on tour in Australia, Frank Worrell, one of the great players in West Indian cricket, was selected, and that was the end of the white captain era. And as I said, it's about this time that the region becomes independent, and so black majority rule is clearly established. It's also worth bearing in mind is that this inaugurates, this leads to what could be the golden era of West Indian cricket. So, but you can see there the win percentage of the West Indies in the white captain era was just under 50%. After the white captain era, it rises, and it rises quite sharply. So in the early 60s, they actually do pretty well, but actually it tails off in the late 60s and early 70s, and they have a sort of a rough period. And then from the mid 1976 until 1995, it's this golden era where they have a 66% win percentage. When you think that a lot of these games are tied, they barely lost during this era. They were just the dominant team in cricket, and they outshone everyone in batting and bowling. They were just incredible. And then since then, I mean, they are the smallest test nation in terms of population size. Of course, the West Indies, these regions are not very wealthy either. So that actually has led to a relative decline, and they've struggled. They've had good times, some good times since, but they've largely struggled. And finally, I want to just go back to Leary Constantine. Leary Constantine was actually, so one thing is CLR James did a lot of ghostwriting for Leary Constantine, so they were close friends. And so Constantine played cricket in England for many years in Lancashire. He became a lawyer and settled in the UK afterwards. And that's a picture of him outside the law courts in London. And he was a founder of the founding member of the board member of the Race Relations Board, which was created as a result of the first anti-discrimination legislation in the UK in 1965. And it's no coincidence. Leary Constantine was fighting against race prejudice for most of his life in one way or another, whether it was in cricket or in other aspects of life. And but he was made a peer of the realm in 1969, and took the name Baron Constantine of Maraval in Trinidad and of Nelson in the County Palatine of Lancaster. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I welcome any questions or comments or suggestions.
Thanks, Stefan. Really fascinating talk. And straight away, Steve has his hand up. So go ahead, Steve.
Thanks. Just fascinating talk. Just a suggestion to other people there, or people who have students who like cricket. My biggest surprise takeaway was the quantitative demonstration of the inefficiency of the selection problem because of the parochial interest of the selectors and the Guyanian. Somebody in business school really ought to do a case study of this Guyanian selection process. But you could do the same statistics, even though whether or not it would tell anything, for all the other major cricket nations, because they also have traditionally had the same sort of geographic issues. So just for anybody interested in that, I think that would be really interesting to just take Stefan's methodology on regional bias and look at it in English counties, Australian states, et cetera. I wanted to then ask Stefan a question about how this turns and the sort of great man theory of making social change, which is obviously nothing would have, no matter who was the captain, 20 years later, you would have had a black captain. Probably no matter who was the captain 20 years earlier, you would have never had a captain. But what is the significance of, you just briefly mentioned it, but Frank Worrell is generally regarded as not only one of the great cricketers of all time, but one of the great captains of all time. And to what significance of it was that the gap between any white West Indian and Frank Worrell in captaining ability was so great that when you combined it with the other factors, that was a significant factor. And what does that say to you generally about this idea of individuals being a key turning point to what Coase would say would be overcoming key bargaining cost problems in getting to a more efficient result?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That is actually a great question, and actually, unfortunately, I think you put your finger on one of my biggest problems with this analysis, which is that you'll notice the title is about white captains, but actually, my data is about batting and bowling performance, not about captaining. Because one thing is, I don't know how one could control for the impact of the captain. That what the captain does is so nebulous, and there are so many other factors in a game like the weather, the conditions, the location, which impact this. It's hard to say how you could construct a reasonable counterfactual about what the captaining performance would have been absent what would have been if you had chosen a different captain. And one of the things, it strikes me, one way in which this white captain policy affected things was that there were white people being selected who weren't very good. Not necessarily an overrepresentation of white people, hence the selection probability, but white people selecting white captains, influencing the selectors to choose their white friends. So it's almost like the whites knew that they were a minority. They knew they only had a quota, and the question was, how do we fill that quota? So I think that, so I think that does raise. I think you raise a problem, and a really interesting question is what matters. Again, anecdotally, we know that this guy JDC Goddard was just hopeless at captaining. Everybody said he was. There was a universal agreement on this, and yet he was the captain. So in that sense, it's hard to know how one would model it, but it seems to be something that was understood.
Just a thought that springs to mind there, Stefan, is couldn't you kind of do a fixed effects type thing? Look at the fixed effects for particular captains to get a sense of, on average, they're winning a bit more often or losing a bit more often, because presumably a good captain would lead to a team winning more often than they should, a bad captain winning less often than they should.
Yeah, oh, right. No, so one thing sorry, I should step back here. I did use captain. I aimed to put in captain dummies, right? And there was well, I suppose the captain dummies didn't really change anything. They didn't really change anything in the regression. So what you're saying is put in captain dummies for the result, right?
Yeah.
The problem with that is with only 84 games, I'm not sure you're going to get very much. Of course, you could then extend this to all test matches and put in dummies. But then, I think there's going to be so much noise in this. And again, it's still only 84 games. I think that's going to be a problem. But it's a possible way forward.
So I wouldn't want to hold up any other questions. So Jorge is next, followed by Alex. No, sorry, followed by Daniele, then Alex.
Is it Jorge? Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Jorge.
Hi. I am learning now finally something about cricket, which I saw it when I was a kid in England, and I never understood anything. But I have a question, because essentially you're talking about implicit discrimination. But so and you're having the problem about really the behavior within the team, or you know what the captain does. You cannot observe that. And I was wondering, because it came to mind what happened to Brazil in the 1930s, for instance, when they flew to a World Cup in Europe, in Italy and in France. They sent the black players in a lower level, like, you know, the Titanic in third level and the whites were on the first level. So there was, you know, there was also this explicit discrimination at the time. And I was wondering when you have, well, first, if, you know, if there was, since they fly a lot because they are island stuff, if there's some kind of evidence that they discriminating how they fly or they travel, or how they stay, you know, maybe the whites stay in a better hotel than the others. And when you have the black captain, you know, whether this kind of behavior changes, because I'm the black captain and I don't want to send my peers in a different source. And then one history question which just comes to me: why cricket is only in England and not in Scotland, or, you know, or Wales? I'm just very curious about that.
Oh, that requires a very long answer. But so on your first question, I mean, I do think, I mean, one of the things about this is interesting is that the way that discrimination works is very different. So again, the obvious contrast here is baseball, right? Baseball in the United States. Baseball just had a color bar. Whites don't play with blacks. That's it. Now, partly that's a function of the fact that there was a very large white population. I mean, the white population in the United States is a majority, and the black population is a minority. So you can implement a color bar. It really, given that the population of these islands only 2% of whites, then the idea of a color bar there doesn't really make much sense. So in some sense, the discrimination is more subtle, and it's very gentlemanly, if I can put it that way. It's they don't, so you can't join the white club, or it's very unlikely you can join them. You might be, if you're black, you might be able to. If you're a really good cricketer, you might be able to join the white club, but you probably can't. They probably won't, and they won't say we're not going to let you in because you're black. They'll say, well, usually it'd be something financial. Sorry, you need to pay a membership fee. And as CLR James points out, this kind of discrimination of self-sorting was going on not just between whites and non-whites, but within the non-white population. There's all these ranges of discrimination. And so and again, you know, CLR James says, you know, the Europeans are encouraging this, they're creating this. But notice, I mean, the language of this is that this is a society which is essentially sick because all these artificial distinctions are being created. So underneath on the surface, you'd have seen, when you saw the West Indian team coming to England in this time, you'd have seen black players and the white players mixing socially and going to the same events and you know, traveling in the same class and so forth. But still, they know what the distinctions are. They're aware of that. So it's a more, the discrimination is really quite subtle. It's in that sense perhaps all the more pernicious, but it's still done in a subtle way. The other, why do the Scots do play cricket? The Scots, the Welsh, the Irish play cricket, but and there is actually a Scottish cricket team and I don't know if there's a Welsh cricket team. There is an Irish cricket team. I don't know if there's a Northern Irish cricket team. But traditionally, they don't have test match status. And because traditionally this game was played in England. And essentially Wales and Scotland and Ireland are a lot damper than England. It's actually, though, there's more rain. And you need dry weather to play this game. You need warm, dry weather. And although the United Kingdom is generally not warm and dry, by and large, England has a larger share of the warm, dry weather. And so the game really evolved in England and never caught on in Scotland in the same way that soccer did, for example. I think that it's more about condition. But actually, some captains of the English team, several captains of the English team, have actually been Scottish. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jorge. Thanks, Stefan. Sarah points out that the England Cricket Board is actually the England and Wales Cricket Board. Next question is Daniele, followed by Alex and Klaus.
Yeah, so very interesting. I have to share your disappointment that the title had captains in it. It's really not about captains. it's really about a period of discrimination in West Indian cricket, and I mean, I'm not that's what the paper is, but it's so I guess sort of it's the story that you're telling is one that there's discrimination and selection, that not necessarily the the best players are selected, even though it's not so clear once you sort of control for performance in the local leagues. And here's sort of where the captaincy issue comes. Like, is there a sense in which perhaps white players or black players perform differently under different captains? And maybe this was going back to the suggestion that James was making. Can you include not a dot for whether they were the captain, but captain fixed effects, right? How does your performance vary with controlling for who the captain was? And is that sort of does that interact with with race? Another question. So you in the end you showed that the lower tail of the distribution there seems to be some favoritism for whites. Can you sort of supplement by showing differences in batting order? I think that's information that you do know, right? If for the opening batsman or like number 4, number 5. So I'm not enough of an expert in cricket to know who the the best batsman is, but sometimes you have like some sort of swashbuckling number 6 or 7 who comes in and saves the inning at the end, whereas the number 1 or 2 are they have sort of different characteristics, like to hold the fort at the beginning. So that could be like another outcome to look at, and perhaps do you see like an overrepresentation of batters at these perhaps lower whites at these lower impact batting orders? That would be a possibility. And yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if I said sort of disappointed. It's not. The paper is great. You gave me a bad look, but the paper is interesting. It's just that I think captains and like the role of captains is like super interesting, and unfortunately the the data that you have is not super conducive to answer that. And let me just sort of finish with one comment: is that cricket has this great specializations, like this Adam Smith, but then you have a player who why isn't there a specialization? Why isn't there a coach who actually is in charge of all these decisions? And why is it there's a player who is the captain that at the same time has to perform and also worry about how to place the fielders and who bowls and what to do if you win the toss and all this other stuff. So that's just sort of mysterious.
Thanks, Danny. Some great comments, and I'm used to being disappointing, so it doesn't really come as a it doesn't really hurt. The point you make about batting order, right? That's a great point, and I'm going to try that out. I think that might have potential. I mean, the captain fixed effects, I just don't think there's anything there, but I think the batting order point is very good. So I think that's some potential. As for specialization, I mean, there are coaches now. I mean, they have coaches, but I mean, bear in mind that essentially for most of this period, this is essentially an amateur sport, and it's not really developed. There's very little money in it. Even those who are paid are getting very little to pay. So in some sense, we're talking about the early development of sport, and that. So, but the specialized tasks have come in now.
Great, thanks, Daniele. We've got Alex and then Klaus. And if you can keep the questions short and the responses short, Stefan, that'll be great because we're pushing up against our time.
So, thank you, Stefan, for a nice talk about the second biggest sport in the world, if I understand correctly, right? Now, I was wondering, and your last answer actually gives me even stronger intuition about it. Is there any chance, or do you know something that actually black players fix the games? Because before that, you said that local managers or big people in the island, they said, we wish England wins. And then maybe there was some pressure on the players to fix the results of the game. And if those players are black players, so their real performance is actually better than they actually performed, and then even some of your white coefficients, which were not significant, they would have become significant and negative. And why am I saying this? Because now you also said that this was a very amateur sport without money, and we all know that if you have an amateur sport with no money and some big interest, big political interest, there might be some match fixing. That's my question.
It's possible. To be honest, in reading the histories of this, I've never read of any suggestion that there was match fixing. That doesn't mean to say that it wasn't happening, but I've not seen any suggestion that that was going on.
Klaus.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. I think it's a fascinating, data-driven forensic study with a lot of interesting anecdotes as well. So I really appreciate the paper here. I want to ask about something you mentioned just in the end. What has happened with West Indian cricket after 1960? And I think you gave a plausible explanation of the growth and the decline of West Indian cricket, but really I think it's not. I think I need more. I would like more kind of convincing explanation, because it was a really big change. Because I saw the data from 67 to 2000. England didn't win any Test matches with the West Indies, home and abroad. From 2000 to 2017, West Indies didn't win any Test matches with England, home and abroad. So there was if you just take this as a kind of indicator of the ranking of West Indian cricket, it shows an enormous change. So is that really because during that period the role of money became more pronounced, and West Indies suffered because they have a very little population, or are there other features at place? And I was fascinated by what you talked about, the conflicts between people from Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados in West Indian cricket. And I just recently read the famous book by James Reade about White Sargasso Sea, about who they give a very vivid explanation of the conflicts and even hostility between the different West Indies countries here, or islands. And so can this have had an effect? I mean, these kind of conflicts could have been kept at a lower level when it was the relation to the white captains, and then when Jamaica or the other countries became independent, then these kind of conflicts grew or become more significant. Or well, that's just one potential explanation. But I wonder, it wasn't a major turn here around 2000. That West Indies were by far the best nation until then, and then it became in an international level mediocre here. So what is the reason for this, and could it have something to do with these kind of internal West Indies contradiction or hostilities, or that were more pronounced after the English disappeared?
That's an interesting point, but I don't think so, because I mean, inter-island rivalry has been a fact of life in the West Indies for forever. So during British rule, it was there, and of course the great era of West Indies cricket, which I would say is about 1976 to 1995, is post-independence. And I would say, I think the explanation is rather simple. Remember, the cricket, effectively at Test match level, we're talking about a relatively small number of games, which are dominated by a relatively small number of players who are the stars on each team. And between 1976 and 1995, the West Indies just had pretty much every player was a world-class star. And they just, while since then they have had the occasionally good player, they actually haven't had the consistent star quality. And the other thing you said about England versus West Indies, I mean, bear in mind, you have to remember there's two sides you need to talk about. I mean, I grew up and watch cricket during that era, and England were just crap. They were just appalling. I mean, they lost to everybody. I mean, it wasn't specific to the West Indies. Ask an Australian. I mean, they'll just tell you.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Klaus, and thanks, Stefan. There's one final short question that Sarah has asked, which is whether you know the race of the umpires, Stefan.
Oh, that's a great question. Can we have another hour? Because that's really interesting. So it turns out that so you would think that the umpires would be all white, right? That would be your presumption based on this, because that would be the status and the decision makers. Not the case. They had black umpires all the time, non-white umpires, mixed race, whatever. And that's really interesting, I think, that this was just the captain. Nothing else. Really strange.
Well, you'll have another hour at some point in the future, I'm sure. But thank you, Stefan, for that. We will wrap up and we'll return again next week. Joel Carroll from the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK is going to present the Sterling Effect, investigating racial discrimination, common topic in the English football labour market. So do join us next week and do pay attention to all of the various submission deadlines to conferences coming up. Thanks, everyone. See you all soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.